a new initiative in order to examine this particular nexus between technology and freedoms, focused on the integrity of elections. So I certainly hope that Fabrice will be able to share more of his insights with us on that particular note. Then also allow me to introduce you Taylan, who I've met a bit more recently through his political activism in Turkey. He's one of the people in Turkish politics who, because of his background in Silicon Valley for more than a decade, brings a fresh approach to politics, and particularly concerning the linkage on how to use technology in politics, how technology will affect our lives, but also the overall political framework. So let me start with you, Fabrice, and ask you really, first of all, to put a context, namely when I remember now almost more than, perhaps 2 decades ago, with the advent of the internet, there was a lot of optimism in the air. Some of these people were called techno-optimists. They believed that the advent of the internet would actually allow us to broaden the scope of fundamental freedoms. But fast forward a decade, really, and we've come across many examples of exactly the opposite being happening. Technology being used to constrain freedoms, not to boost, enhance freedoms. So how do you, from your perspective, both formerly with NATO, but now that you also have an outreach to many of those players, how do you assess this relationship, firstly?
Thank you very much, Sinan, and a great pleasure to be with you online and to meet for the first time, and hopefully not the last time, Thailand, and to speak on a topic that I think has become much more central to every of us living under the conditions we've been living since the past few months. And let me start here and then finish on what we see in terms of disinformation, foreign interference, and the use of technology. On the first point, the broader point, I think our relationship, the citizens' relationship with technology, has reached a point of great paradox, which was already there before the COVID crisis, but I think it has become even more enhanced. On one hand, I think people have discovered that technology is useful, that technology is good, and it's not this technophobia that started to, as you mentioned earlier, Sinan, over the last few years, that started to kind of develop in the public debate. People have used technology to stay in touch with their family, to be able to do their work in sometimes difficult conditions. And also technology has been part of, I think, the governments and public institutions fight against the disease, both in the medical realm and socially. So actually, I think we've realized our dependence that is also a good dependence. On the other hand, I think there is much more awareness about the excess or the danger of technology dependence. We have seen a huge level of disinformation effort online over the past 4 months. I think if I refer to some EU statistics, there have been more synthetic, automatized disinformation efforts over the last 4 months compared to the last 4 years. So I think many people are aware that now what they receive on WhatsApp or what they see on Twitter is actually to be taken with a pinch of salt. We have also seen issues related to some technology being linked or dependent on certain countries that do have certain agenda, and the most obvious one being China. I think everybody has discovered Zoom as a great work tool, and then it took just a few weeks for people to realize that Zoom is not only secure or fully secured, and that there are also some possible connections with mainland China, which means that some countries are actually not using Zoom as a tool for communication. And we have also discovered, I think, that technology obviously raises the issue of privacy, including in the public health domain, where, you know, about social distancing app, for example, one of the main issues beyond the technology is the privacy aspect, which has made the development of reliable apps even more complicated. So somehow we're in a new place where the technology firms are seen as not so much the bad guys, but still have to go a bit further to be the better guys. And there are still issues around facial recognition, micro-targeting, and around being able to better filter and contain materials online that are inappropriate or polarizing. And so I think that's where we are in the kind of general picture on how us private citizens, but also governments, view and have lived the past few months their relationship with technology. And to finish on your second question about how technology plays its part in our democratic lives, let me just take you the very quick lessons learned of having worked for on behalf of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity for the past few years, where initially our starting point was what happened in the United States in 2016, which was largely Russia interfering via also online platforms to disrupt, to confuse, to polarize the US elections. And since then, we have been monitoring various elections across the world, from Mexico, Sweden, the referendum in Northern Macedonia, to European elections, and also some midterm election in the US. And what we have seen are the following three aspects. One is there is now an increasing level of sophistication of state actors using online tools to interfere in domestic public discourses and democratic processes. What was, I think, mostly in the hands and driven by Russia has now expanded to a league of I would say, the disruptors. That's Russia, China, Iran, and to an extent Turkey, and some few other countries which sometimes even cooperate with the other disruptors, like Venezuela, for example, in the Spanish-speaking world. Venezuela was very active during the Catalonia referendum, as an example. So now we are facing a level of sophistication, which both in the tools, but also in the permanence of the actions. It's no longer linked just to a specific election or to a specific candidate or party. It's almost a permanent threat and activity upon our democratic life and public discourse. The second aspect, and this is more problematic, and we should be discussing that hopefully, is that
just give us the title, Fabrice. I'll come back to you regarding the second aspect.
Yeah, it's just that foreign interference has gone local. It's no longer about foreign powers interfering in our domestic democratic process. It's increasingly about local actors using foreign powers playbook to actually advance their political interest. And this becomes, from a legal, ethical, political point of view, much more difficult to handle, because you also have freedom of speech. And this is what we have seen in the US, obviously, especially with President Trump, but this is what we have observed on both sides of the aisle. Just one last example, when we monitored some midterm elections, senatorial elections, back last year, we saw a very abnormal level of artificial online activities, and we assumed this was foreign powers. And actually, we looked more at the attribution aspect, and we realized it was coming from actors that were related to the two main parties that were competing for the election. So, and this, I think, raises some fundamental questions for the future of our own democracies.
Yes, thank you. I'll now turn to you, Taylan, but before I do, just allow me, to announce that for the viewers who have kindly joined this debate, you can ask your questions through the chat function of YouTube. We're monitoring that, and I'll be most happy to interact with our two speakers based on those questions. We already have a few of those out there. So, Taylan, to you, and perhaps we hadn't really informed the Turkish president about this webinar that we'll be having today. But as it happens, his remarks yesterday made great advertisement for what we are going to discuss today. So let's start with yesterday. What happened yesterday, and what's the current context of how Turkey looks at technology freedoms, and in this particular case, social media, I suppose.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for hosting me, and Fabrice, it's great meeting you. I hope we're going to collaborate in the future, and thanks to Edam for organizing this wonderful event. So let's refresh our memories a little bit. Like before we go ahead, what President Erdogan said was he made this controversial statement that social media needs to be shut down or needs to be heavily regulated in Turkey. And we have a lot of international listeners over here. So just to set the stage of what's been happening in Turkey, I want to take the first few minutes. So Erdogan's fight with social media has gone up dramatically after the Gezi movement. And around that time, he made a conscious decision to turn up the populist rhetoric. And all these researchers that analyzes Erdogan's speeches at the time classify him as an uber populist, thereby putting him in the company of Venezuela's Maduro and Bolivia's Evo Morales and so on and so forth, right? But in order to understand this keen interest in controlling the social media, we first need to understand why information control is key to his governance in Turkey. And this is a very similar playbook for many of the populist leaders in the world, I believe. He blames many of the failures of his government, be it the costly public projects, Syrian refugee crisis, and so forth, to fictitious foreign powers or opposition parties, which in reality have very little power in the public discourse in Turkey. And in order to sell his ideas to the public, he follows a textbook PR strategy, where he claims the public that they won't be worse off. He redefines the projects as best of the world. He belittles opposition views and so on and so forth. And he repeats all of these steps over and over again. And this whole effort requires him to control the narrative and own the truth, if you will. And information that's dispersed through social media stains that image, and that he is meticulously crafting, hence needs to be silenced, in his world. And in particular, Twitter has been used as an alternative to newspapers, while YouTube has been used as an alternative to TV by the opposition, and both have been under tremendous pressure to be regulated. And if you look, internet freedom in Turkey is classified as not free by the Freedom House's Freedom on the Internet report, and we're now in the shameful company of countries like Saudi Arabia and Syria and Iran. And even war-torn places like Libya have higher freedom score than Turkey at the moment. Let's just leave it at that. And obviously, the government is actually using informational, technical, and legal tactics to actually oppress the opposition through the social media. And I'm not going to go into the details, and we can go in the next round if you would like. But from the legal point of view, their tactics have been very front and center in the public discourse, so I'm sure most of us are very aware of them. So they include arrests of individuals for expressing their political opinions online, as well as establishing new laws and regulations that criminalizes those speeches. And one law that was passed in 2018, which granted the Radio and Television Supreme Council, also known as RTÜK in Turkish, supervision rights of all visual and audio content that is broadcasted over the internet. And that law requires all online broadcasters, even individual YouTube streamers, to apply for online streaming licenses. And any broadcaster that does not comply might get their content removed or get entirely blocked by the state. And RTÜK also can initiate security investigations through the Central Intelligence Agency of Turkey or the police themselves. And let's remember that Turkey ranks 158th out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index, and many of the Turkish journalists were forced out of their mainstream media positions and had to start a career in independent online broadcasting. And this law that they passed a few years back is a move to silencing dissenting voices like this. And obviously, we live in a world where 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube each and every minute, and streaming platforms like Netflix actually have thousands and thousands of movies online, and the absurdity of having a central body that is designed to regulate a few public broadcasts over free airways to control endless online content is evident. And obviously, this is not a move to make internet safe for all Turkish citizens, since it's impossible to implement. And
Taylan, let me, you're going to continue, but I would also like you to tell us a little bit about, also based on your personal experience. Now, we all know about these constraints. We have to struggle with them every day. But at the same time, it seems to me that since this is the, the theme of our session, that technology, and in particular the internet, social media, has contributed to a more lively discussion, which is fundamental for any, democratic society. So what's been your experience in terms of how the internet and social media has impacted Turkish politics per se?
Sure. And before we go, I want to make one final comment about this latest law that they're trying to pass, which actually is in the works of passing this law, which says companies like Facebook and Google, they have 72 hours a notification period with penalties up to 1 million Turkish liras for each and every post. And this puts the burden on social media companies to determine what is within the freedom of speech and what is not. And as a platform, they might think that a particular post is within the rights of a user, but if a Turkish court disagrees with that, then the social media company will be fined. And this inevitably might lead to these companies to be very, very conservative as to what they consider as free speech, as they wouldn't want to risk having to pay large sums of fines, which in turn will generate self-censorship without the state even needing to involve courts at all. And if we had a functioning court system like they have in the Western states, then most of our worries would be actually unjustified. But we all know how the justice system works in Turkey, so I believe this is super problematic what the president and the government is trying to implement at this point.
Okay. Now, in the second round, I'll be asking you to give us an answer as to your own experience about how social media has changed Turkish politics, because we've talked, at length about, these negative developments, but there must be a positive side to it as well, of the technological advances. Fabrice, let me turn to you. I will ask you to do two things in this round. One is, talk about your own initiative, your own co-initiative, rather, about the Digital Commission for the Integrity of Elections. But before that, I will also ask you about, through your NATO career and now, where do you see the main problematic areas of this, technology freedoms relationship? Of course, one is on, disinformation in elections, which you will be talking about more at length. But what are the other areas, even though we may not go at length because of scarcity of time, but still it would be good to have them out there.
To answer your last question, I think one needs to take a step back and look at the broader picture. And that connects with what Taylan was saying, describing the Turkish government's attempt to actually stiffen and narrow basically online freedom. I think we are not there yet in having found a middle way between no regulation and too much regulation, between basically US system that puts a great emphasis on freedom of speech and a very libertarian approach, to the Chinese, Russian, and it sounds increasingly Turkish model. And I think the question in the coming years is whether we're going to manage us Western democracies or the liberal democracies to carve an alternative model which minimize the risks linked to overuse of technology, whilst allowing and guaranteeing the individual rights and freedom to express their views. And I think hopefully that crisis will accelerate this work. I think the European Union is on the path to do that. The question is whether the US, especially if there were a change of US administration, will adopt actually a more European model rather than the current system, which is very open and therefore also open to abuse.
Okay, Fabrice, tell us a little bit about this European model, what it is, what it intends to do, and in which way is it different than the US model?
Well, what it is for the moment is mostly the famous GDPR regulation, which basically guarantees your personal right in knowing how your data, your personal data, are stored and used by any company where you are registered online and that you use. And that was seen as a breakthrough and as a model for many other democracies to go forward, even though GDPR is actually also quite imperfect in different aspects. I don't need to go into the specifics, but the GDPR was seen as a first step to guarantee the individual's right about what their data are being used and how they are being used by private companies. Where the European Union is going next, I think next is several things. One is the liability of the online platforms, which is really the core of the debate. You have heard Mark Zuckerberg saying, you know, we are not a newspaper. We are not liable. We're not responsible for the content. We are just an enabler of people's content. But as we know, the algorithm that enhance and amplify the content that anyone posts on Facebook or to an extent on Twitter is also, in fact, some kind of editorial choice. So I think the European Union is going towards, with the Digital Services Act, going towards putting more responsibility on the online platform for the content that they are posting online. And this is going to be a fierce battle, because this is really touches at the core of the business model, especially of Facebook. That's one thing. Another one is the liability of companies using artificial intelligence. As you know, this is a growing technology and is going to be used in almost all sectors of life, but in certain sectors like automobile, transport, public health, they are going to be a question of who is responsible when basically a freak AI accident happens. And it's going to be about putting a burden of responsibility on the AI producer and not just the AI operator or the AI user. That's another important thing. And finally, and I think that's also another breakthrough, it's going to be about putting a framework on how people, companies, and governments can better share data. Because basically the way things work now, there is no norms and standards about how business can share data between themselves, but also how private business can share data with public entities and vice versa. And yet we're sitting on this natural resource, which is called data, and we have not put, in a way, a regulatory framework to say what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and therefore to fully exploit this natural resource. So I think the EU in the coming years is going to put more clarity on what are the do's and the don'ts of fully optimizing what has become de facto one of our biggest natural resources in our modern economy, which is data.
Okay. Fabrice, just
yes.
Before, I mean, I'm going to ask you to talk also about the Digital Commission, but I'll turn to Thailand before that and give you the floor afterward as well. But before I do that, on your first note, namely this, slated European initiative about establishing the framework for a platform liability, for the liability of the platforms. Because this is something that is of immense concern to us as well, and Thailand already alluded to that to some extent. So how will the platforms themselves judge whether they are on the right side of their obligations or on the wrong side of their obligations? So what's the European way that will help them judge whether for specific content they can be liable to exposure or not?
Yes.
So what's the vehicle that will help them to make that assessment, or what's the thinking on that? Because that's obviously a huge risk, and if that is not tackled, as Thailand has mentioned, then that would lead to censorship, which is not obviously compatible with the type of democratic society that we want.
Absolutely, and this is why there's a fine line between regulating and stiffening. And I'm not the one writing the new regulation, so I cannot speak for the European Commission. But my understanding is that there's already consensus on all content that is deemed harmful or abusive content that can lead to violence or incite to violence. So I think there's already a broad consensus on that. And then there is the content that is seen as polarizing and misleading, meaning you present something as true or factually grounded, whilst in fact it's not correct, and will lead people to believe the things that are not in line with reality. And this is where I think the question of freedom of speech comes into play, because you might be, entitled to say things that are not totally true, but this is, if it's your opinion, it doesn't have to be fully matched by facts. And this is where I think there's going to be a very difficult conversation, because also the Europeans don't see the same way. I think in Germany, there is a slightly broader definition of freedom of speech, with some restriction due to Germany's history, because of restriction linked to racism and anti-Semitism. Whilst in France, I think there is I would say, a stricter definition of what is to a kind of inappropriate content. So there's going to be inside Europe itself a complicated discussion. And then there's going to be a real back and forth with the big online companies. And I think the first of which is going to be Facebook. Because the bottom line with Facebook is that the core of its business model is what you call the attention economy. It's about generating as many views, as many clicks as possible, in order to basically tell advertisers, look, I can provide you with that many million people who are going to pay attention to your advertisement. And the content that creates a lot of clicks and discussions online is often the most extreme, polarizing, controversial content. And, Facebook is trying to make, I think, a lot of cosmetic changes. But the business model remains that one. And whether the EU will lean hard enough to Facebook to be really willing to change the core of their business model will be the really defining question here. So this is not, I think, given that we're going to have a legislation that will solve all the questions, but I think we're heading in that direction. And one last thing, I think what is interesting, and we contributed, the Transatlantic Commission contributed to that. There is a transatlantic conversation going on between some US lawmakers and their European counterparts about the European model. I'm thinking especially of a senator called Senator Mac Warner, who's one of the most tech-savvy senators in the US Senate, who is actually engaged very closely with what the Europeans are doing, because it could be that towards the next administration, I think Washington might look at how the EU is handling the question of freedom of speech versus appropriate speech to replicate that in the US.
Okay, thank you, Fabrice. Thailand, now I want to turn to you and really again ask you the perspective of somebody who has not only professionally had an interest in this, but also practiced it in your own political endeavors. So the question that I had left you in the previous round is, you've been quite eloquent in describing how social media was constrained by government action. And that's all true. But at the same time, I'm also going to ask you what sort of new perspectives, new horizons, new abilities social media has brought to politics, and talk a bit about the positive aspect of this relationship.
Sure, definitely. So first of all, when you look at especially Turkish youth about how do you express your opinion, how do you actually raise your demands, half of the Turkish population, young population, a bit under the age of 35, say, I take it to social media. Okay, less than 10% of the people, they say, I take the streets. So in Turkey, especially with this government oppression for the past 20 years, all these kids that have actually learned to raise their opinions online and not really offline. So in that sense, having an organization that enables and that actually helps the grassroots organizations to actually take hold in the online space actually have been tremendously useful for us. I'll give you an example. we had one campaign where we said the campaign's theme was, you don't let us take the streets, so we're going to take the streets off Twitter, something to that effect in English. And that got like 200,000 likes and so forth. And the reason was it actually touched a very common theme where people really wanted to do something, but they only wanted to do something online. So in that sense, social media has created a great outlet for people to voice their opinions. And if you can harness it the right way, that has tremendous potential. And the way that we did it in our past campaigns is, if online feeds offline campaigns, offline operations, and offline in turn feeds on online operations, then that becomes the best. I'll give you an example. We would actually say, hey, you know what? We're having this meeting and we're going to go to internet cafe, and then we're going to have this huge rally afterwards, and people would actually do it. And then in the rally, we're going to say, thanks to all the online guys that actually showed up today, and so forth. And then we would actually air that same night on YouTube, and then people online would then feed off of it, feed off of energy, and then show up at the next rally the next day. So if you can create this like online to offline cycle, especially in Turkish politics, where online is the main driver, it was very useful for us. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is we talked a lot about Facebook. So we also obviously use Facebook for some of the social media advertising and whatnot. And it actually gives you the ability to be able to say, hey, you know what? Here are my 10 issues that I raised in the public discourse, economics, education, constitutional rights, and so on and so forth. And here are the cookie pools. Here are the Facebook guys that are interested in X versus Y versus Z. And you tell Facebook, can you give me 1 million more of these people that are likely to be interested in education, but not in economics, for example? And Facebook gives you that. And that enables you to actually target these people online and do advertising to them. But again, I mean, this is also a double-edged sword, right? So where does the information end and where does the manipulation begin? I think that's one of the subjects that we'll be discussing very heavily in the next 5, 10, 20 years, because we give information, and I know we do because I run it, but not everybody does that, right? So you might actually have a lot of misinformation, a lot of falsehoods and whatnot that resonates with a particular crowd, and you just keep feeding that information. And one example I'll give from Donald Trump's campaign, actually, and these are the true numbers from Facebook's internal memos, is Donald Trump actually tested ad copies of 5.9 million ads, whereas Hillary Clinton only tested 60,000 ads. So imagine what kind of fine graining that they have done in their political campaign. So I think to wrap it up, I think it creates tremendous potential, especially if you're very creative, because these companies are obviously in it for the money. So, for example, if you have 1 million Facebook users, your posts are not going to go to 1 million users. You have to pay Facebook even to reach your own followers. So in that sense, it's an expensive game to play. And the only way to beat it without money is to be really humorous, to be really smart about it. And we, for example, have done one campaign in which we had these Google search terms that we actually bought from Google, right? And then the term was, for example, VPN download, okay? And our ad would come and it would say, hey, you know what? You don't have to download VPN. After the election, the internet will be free. And we've gotten all sorts of awards for that kind of campaign. And I mean, it was smart, it was nice, and it got like international coverage as well. And by doing that, we got so much free press and free eyeballs and free recognition that we couldn't do otherwise. But again, I mean, this really needs a very harmonizing team that can actually deliver.
Taylan, let me ask you on this, and maybe I'll turn to Fabrice as well with the same question. What we've seen, especially after the controversy in the United States, is with the exception of Facebook, with the global internet, the social media platforms, actually, eliminating political advertising from their platforms. Mm-hmm. That's been a corporate decision with Twitter. basically many of them except Facebook. Now, this, we understand, is a byproduct of the controversy that we witnessed in the United States, especially after Trump's election, the Cambridge Analytica scandal and so on. But at the same time, it seems to me, and this is perhaps the law of unintended consequences, that, the use of these platforms allows a higher degree of political communications and by extension political competition. When I look at the Turkish political market, quote unquote, this allows the smaller players, the ones that are not as well endowed as the incumbents, so who can't allocate advertising budget to monopolize TV and billboards, to actually have another vehicle through which to reach new or existing political constituents. But when these platforms do put barriers to political advertisement, that perversely actually harms democracy and political competition. I tend to believe. Now, fortunately for me, perhaps less fortunately for others, Facebook remains in the market, so you can still use Facebook to do this. But how do you assess this? I mean, for you, is it a positive impact? Is it a positive consequence that these, except Facebook, these platforms have gone out of the business of political advertisement and political communication? Does that ensure a safer, democracy? Or could we argue that, on the contrary, it actually skews, democracy towards an even more unfair set of, dynamics? What would be your assessment?
So the thing is, when people talk about advertising, advertising actually has two main purposes. Okay, one is advertising is a source of information, which actually makes a society better because it makes people more educated so that we can actually compare the options much easier and so on and so forth. This is one aspect of advertising. But the second aspect of advertising is advertising creates loyalty. And when you do loyalty, the price sensitivity actually decreases, which means people just stick with one brand, and it could be a political brand as well, just because of some emotional hooks and so on and so forth. So it really depends on why you're doing the advertising. For us, for example, we always do advertising with respect to, how we're going to make Turkey better, which is project-based, and that's information, and that's good for the society. So in that sense, blocking those kind of ads is really harmful, not just for the party itself, but also for the Turkish political discourse. And you guys actually have done a tremendous job with one of the latest studies that you have done about the cybersecurity, in which you guys show in Adam, there are echo chambers in Turkey, and in order to cross those echo chambers, typically organic posts are not enough. So you need to be able to plant those seeds across the aisle, and to do that, you need to be able to do advertising. And one very typical example is, for example, we've done offline billboards, okay, in one of the in the parliamentary elections, and the next day, that was in Ankara, all our billboards were ripped apart. Like somebody literally, they took a pair of scissors or something, or pulley or something, they ripped out our papers. So we made a post. We said, you know what, we're glad you can't really scrape off monitors, so that we can actually do digital advertising, right? It's an area in which we can actually reach people without the interference of third party interventionists. So in that sense, it's important.
Yeah, Fabrice.
Yes.
Now to you. I will also ask you the same question. How do you assess this decision of global internet platform, social media platforms not carrying political advertising, especially, and also tell us also about the work of your commission, the Digital Commission. Why was it set up? What do you intend to do? How do you intend to make an impact?
On the first question, because I think it's a very important debate, but the way I look at it is should not be seen as a black and white debate about whether you do political advertisements on online or not. And it's a bit the broader debate about censorship or full freedom of speech. I think it should be thinner than that. It's not so much whether you do it, it's how you do it. And I think what's missing, and the way I think it could address the concerns of some people, is to let the users know why he's targeted. When you buy a newspaper, de facto you make a decision that you like that newspaper, that somehow you see yourself as belonging the kind of readership category of the newspaper, and therefore the advertisements you will have in the newspaper, you have accepted de facto that you will be advertised, you will receive some advertisement in the newspaper because you have made a conscious choice. The problem with advertisement online is the targeting, and the targeting is not transparent, because the targeting is based on some of the keywords you've used, some of the conversations online you have had, and then suddenly, basically, because of algorithm, you are going to be seen as part of a category and therefore being served certain advertisements, certain messages, without understanding what's the mechanic behind it. So I think our call to the online platform is not to do or not to do political advertisement, is to be transparent about why certain users get certain kind of advertisements. Because the problem, as we know, with micro targeting, is that here you have political parties and politicians who can basically say different things to different constituencies. And we do know that politicians tend to do that to an extent. But here, because of the fragmentation of the online space, that it's mostly an individual space, you don't know really what the same politician is saying to the other community, because you don't see that. So I think here, the way around it is not to curb political advertisement, as to put much more clarity about why certain advertisements reach certain users. That's one thing. The second thing is, obviously, in some cases of very abusive, harmful content, the online platforms need to be much quicker at taking down content. And we have seen this with Christchurch, where in a way it took too long to take down a video that has been seen by too many people. And I think here, the online platforms can do much better on that front. And then finally, and again, this is about not falling into the trap of the censorship of full freedom of speech debate, is also about rating the editorial quality of whatever content you see. There's an interesting initiative with whom the Transatlantic Commission has been working called NewsGuard. And NewsGuard, which is partly supported by Microsoft, took a different approach to censorship. They said, we're not going to call for taking down Russia Today content, but we're going to rate the editorial quality of Russia Today, so that you can download the NewsGuard app on your browser or on your phone, and whenever you read, whatever you get online, it will tell you how high or low each news provider is rating on actually a grid that has been developed by independent journalists. And that allows, I think, people to make a conscious choice, because here it's not about reducing the choice, it's about putting clarity and transparency on the choice that people make. And then if in the end a user wants to read Russia Today, they are making, I think, a conscious choice that they're going to indeed read content that is highly biased and that is linked to a state. So that's how I will approach that debate. On the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, because my friend Sinan, you keep on saying Digital Commission, but it's Transatlantic Commission. And actually the Transatlantic is one of the reasons we started the initiative, because we realized that there was no transatlantic conversation happening about how to deal with foreign interference in democratic processes. And you might remember that Joe Biden wrote a foreign affairs piece some years ago calling for a 9/11 type commission on the 2016 election. And I thought, this is not going to fly in the highly polarized American political environment. This is not going to work. But actually also that it's a problem that not only the US had, but it's also a problem that we're having in Europe. So we reached out to Joe and we told him, well, I think your 9/11 Commission should be a transatlantic one, because this is a problem that is bigger than the US alone. So that was one thing.
And Fabrice, it's always good to be able to call the newest president by his first name. So
he's actually a really decent, very nice person, very smart on those issues. And he was a member of the Transatlantic Commission until he announced that he was running for the presidential election. And I know he will make the right decisions on those questions if he were to be elected. The other reason we created the Transatlantic Commission is there is also a gap, and I'm sure Thailand is familiar with that, between the policy community and the technology community. They're speaking past each other. They don't speak the same language. Therefore, the political side is going to make some decisions to put some regulation together, because there is a public pressure to do so, which is not going to be necessarily good for innovation and business. And the business community in the technological sector is often too sure of its genius, technological genius, but does not necessarily see the public implication of what they're creating. And we were trying really to not say technology is bad. We were saying, well, technology has become part of the problem. This is true, of disinformation and foreign interference, but it can also be part of the solution. And that was the last priority we have been pursuing, and I will finish there. We've been working with technology firms, from Microsoft to smaller startup companies, to try to develop tools to actually empower civil society, individuals, politicians, to really be able to fight toxic synthetic materials online. And we were actually the first to really talk very explicitly about deepfake and the threat of deepfake. And we were working with a startup based in London to try to basically create a deepfake scanner. An app that you will have on your mobile phone that will allow you to, whenever you receive something from your family on WhatsApp, and you tend to think, well, this is coming from my family, therefore it's credible, but you're not totally sure if it's an authentic video or if it's authentic, you will scan that video with the deepfake scan, and it will tell you what's the level of authenticity or syntheticity of the product. So our Transatlantic Commission is tech neutral in the sense we are not against technology, because we think technology can be part of the solution. But for that, you need to be able to bring different communities together, both in Europe and the US, but also the private sector and the public policy sector.
Yeah. Fabrice, if in the last round, we only have a few minutes left, I would actually ask you to tell us a little bit more about this phenomenon of deepfakes. Which I think is fascinating, both from its potentially positive, but also perhaps even more so from its potentially negative impact. Thailand, I'm going to turn to you for your last few minutes. I'm looking also at the questions from the chat on YouTube, and there are a few questions on data localization and the Turkish government's approach to data localization. Could you tell us, in a few words, your own intuition about how Turkey should strike a balance on this, critical issue of data localization? Should we allow, every sort of data to go up in the cloud, wherever those servers are? Or do you see warranted cases where Turkey should actually impose hard data localization requirements?
Well, I mean, it's a tough subject for sure, and it really requires a public debate, and I don't think there's one good answer to this. But one thing that I would say, for example, is with this recent law proposal that's going around. So one of the things that they're trying to do, the government is trying to do, is for social media companies to host Turkish accounts in Turkey. And this was basically alluding to what Fabrice was talking about. The politicians are talking one language and technologists are talking another language, because this is simply not enforceable and is out of tune with the technical realities of how internet works. Social media companies choose server locations based on their customer locations, based on available human resources, based on proximity to power transmission infrastructure, based on tax incentives, based on utility rates and the like. So what happens is all these data centers are located in a few strategic locations which serve multiple countries at once. So in that sense, trying to localize everything within the confines of Turkey, I don't think it's realistic. To be honest, that's one. And number two, it doesn't even mean that the data is going to be more secure if they were to be hosted in Turkey, if we're talking about the international companies. And also, if you open your Facebook account in Turkey and then you move somewhere else, so where does your account belong to? Or, I mean, if you're a tourist that came to Turkey, where does your data belong to? So the borders that actually we drew, on the globe does not really fit in well within the internet scheme of things. So that's one. But obviously, there are certain issues in which, for example, blockchain-based user data collections and also federated machine learning algorithms, for example, that's something that Google has proposed a few years back. And it's really interesting because typically what happens is with the machine learning algorithms, you pile all the data in one data center, and that could be anywhere in the world, and then you run your algorithms. But here, it allows the user's data just to stay within their own cell phones, and it runs the machine learning within itself, and it just sends the learnings back to Google's or Facebook's mainframe. So that actually mitigates some of these issues that we're talking about. But again, I think there's so much gap between what politicians think and know about technology and public's just knee-jerk reactions and emotions about what technology means and does, and what we as technologists do. And my hope is to be like the bridge between them, being on, 2 feet on 2 different grounds.
No, we're definitely lucky to have you in Turkey as one of the people who is definitely trying to create a bridge between the policy world and the technology world. Fabrice, lastly to you, deepfakes. Tell us about what is a deepfake, and also start by telling us, given that you've been exposed to quite a few perhaps cases of deepfakes, what's the one that impressed you the most?
Yeah, but before I answer that, if I may, just 2 very quick points. I do agree with Thailand. It's not about freedom from. It's not about, I don't want my data to be owned or to be operated by whatever cloud company. It's the freedom to, meaning it's the freedom to be able to control, use your data at will. And I think it's a bit of a fake debate to say, we need to have our own cloud computing system here in Europe because like this, we're not dependent on the Americans. No, I think we need to have the guarantees that whatever data we store, wherever we decide to store, we are fully owning and being able to access this data. So it's not the freedom from, it's the freedom to use the data, one thing. Second, and I put this challenge to Thailand for the next election in Turkey, we actually, the Transatlantic Commission, we had launched the Election Integrity Pledge. We had asked all the European Parliament candidates to sign a 5-point pledge saying they will not use deepfake, they will not use troll, they will educate their party activists in basic social media manners and also IT hygiene. And we got a really big uptake in Europe, including all the leading Spitzenkandidaten, all the leading party candidates signed it. And it was a way to put some kind of gentle pressure on politicians that obviously it's not a legal obligation, it's a moral one. But I think we are planning to apply the same election pledge to the next election in Georgia. And actually, Joe Biden, one of the first things he did when he announced his run for the presidential election, signed the pledge. And there's a whole video of him signing the pledge and calling on the other candidates, to also join the pledge. So this is something I think that is a way to take the moral high ground on those questions where the law and regulation cannot solve everything. Then on your question on deepfake, basically deepfake is a computer-generated either video or audio material. So it's a fully artificial piece of video or audio that is created by basically an agent, an AI agent, which is going to use different videos and audio materials available online to create a synthetic one sui generis. And that basically, the technology is evolving fast, it's getting cheaper and cheaper, which the assumption is in few years' time, we will be able to do deepfake in our basement. And the problem is, at the moment, you can still more or less distinguish deepfakes from authentic materials with the human eye. But increasingly, the technology being, advancing the way it advances, it will be almost impossible to detect what is a deepfake or not. And then the question will be about the media relaying some videos that are actually not authentic. And so the question is, how do we equip ourselves to counter the proliferation of deepfakes? And we've seen Donald Trump proliferating some, I would say, homemade deepfakes, which didn't fool anyone, but were powerful enough to set the agenda. The deepfake on Nancy Pelosi made the US news agenda for a week. So deepfake are extremely toxic because they basically don't distort things, they just give you a parallel reality. And this is why we think we need to build some tools to actually counter them. And what is the one that impressed me most? Actually, this is a funny story. We at the Transatlantic Commission developed a deepfake audio of President Trump announcing to the US citizens on the US radio that following a Russian attack, he had decided to basically launch all the US nuclear power against the Russian Federation. And we were at the Paris Peace Forum 2 years ago, and we ran that audio by random people at the Paris Peace Forum, including also very senior executive from Microsoft Corporation. And actually, including that senior executive from Microsoft Corporation got fooled. He thought it was actually a pretty authentic one. It was just, a trick by Donald Trump, but he did not spot that this was a fully artificial computer-generated audio file. So this is where we are now, and I think this is why we have to be fully aware of what's coming.
Okay, thank you, Fabrice. Thank you, Taylan. Thank you also to all our listeners. It was, a great pleasure to be able to talk to you. I very much hope that we can have other iterations, given how fast this field is moving and the very significant challenges that we have. I particularly want to end this with something that, you both referred, which is really a need to bridge the policy world with the technology world. And as people who are interested in both policy and technology, I think there's a lot more that we should be doing in this field. So thank you for all your efforts so far, and keep up the good work. And let's try to do things also collaboratively in this direction, and which hopefully will generate even more interest.
Thanks a lot, Sinan. Thanks, Taylan. Nice meeting you. Bye. Bye.